Hello and welcome to Bruton Knowles Landmark Podcast. I'm James Bailey, Managing Partner here at Bruton Knowles, and today we're focusing on the future of our water infrastructure. I'm joined by Nigel Billingsley, Head of Utilities and Infrastructure North, and Giles Lister, Head of Utilities. We'll be talking about the UK's ambition to build new reservoirs, the realities behind delivery and delay, and the broader picture of water infrastructure, from pipelines to new housing developments to flood management and how the UK compares with Europe. We'll also explore the practical challenges, regulatory landscape, and what it really takes to deliver infrastructure at scale. So we have 9 water companies in total committing to building new reservoirs by, and it's that date again, it's 2050. Nigel, what do you think in terms of that? It sounds very, very ambitious. What's your thought about building new reservoirs in what is only 24 years away?
Well, at one level, you can see that as a huge increase in the number of reservoirs that we've got, because we haven't really built reservoirs for decades.
No.
So it's a real start again position. So in some ways, people are learning how to do this again, but of course, internationally, lots of reservoirs have been built. I think there are a number of interesting things about the way that we're looking at it. And one is that principally they're in the south and southeast. And so what we're looking at generally are sort of flat areas. So it's very different from the old reservoirs that we built up in places like the Lake District and Snowdonia areas. But I think it's interesting to think why we're trying to achieve these. And I think one of the interesting points is that it's around increasing population. It's around climate change, as we see particularly the south of England starting to become drier. And also it's addressing that long-term underinvestment, where if you haven't built reservoirs for decades and decades, then this is where you get to. And I think what probably sits behind it is privatisation back in a few decades ago, where I think a lot of companies moved from a long-term programme of investment to something which was more around maintenance. And now we're up to, I think, AMP7 or 8. It's something that we really need to think about and address that problem. So I think it is achievable. I mean, 24 years is a long time.
It is.
If you think about what can be achieved in that time. And I think part of it is how we as a country look at delivering infrastructure, because some infrastructure is taking far too long. We don't need to quote other types of industries such as fast railways, but lots of things have taken too long. But I think certainly I'm acting for 1 or 2 clients affected by these reservoirs, and it seems to me that the water companies are progressing at some pace. So I think once they've got the land and consent sorted out, I suspect the period of time they've got to build these things and get them in place is sufficient for 2050. Yeah, that's
good. That's reassuring to hear. Giles, what's your reaction to this? We've obviously known about it for a little while. Do you think 2050 is achievable?
The water resources management plan that the water authorities have got will provide us all with a guide to the future and how we will have enough water, hopefully, and how we manage those water supplies over the period. And it's not just the water companies in isolation, it's the government, it's the EA. Everybody's got to look at that policy towards supply of water and how they maintain the current levels of supply. So they've got to look at things like saving water. What do? We have to be more efficient in terms of that use. We also have to think about all the development that's going on. Actually, should we be installing equipment that allows us to recycle, that will reduce that intake? Everybody jumps up and down about water supply, the water authorities and how the water companies and how they deal with their leakage. The volumes that are disappearing into the ground is phenomenal. All the companies are trying to do something about it, and they are stepping up to the mark in most cases, but there's a long way to go because they need to look at how they store and maintain those supplies, and one of the ways that they're going to lose them is through leakage big time. Alternatives are actually, they've got the existing supplies of water through pipes, through rainfall, rivers, etc. how are they going to look at alternatives? And the alternatives may be looking at things like desalination, but there's massive input from an energy perspective on desalination. I know certain water companies have looked at desalination, but the actual cost of it is significant, that has thrown out the total cost because it's just too expensive. And there are other water companies that the supply is required, but actually how do they get it from the sea into the middle of the country? It's a bit like the electricity side of it. Their network was through the middle of the country. They need to be the outside. It's the same with the water, in that if you desalinate, you've got to get from the water to the centres where most of the cities are located. So it is very difficult, but I think it is doable in the long term.
Yeah, I think both of you alluded to, a lot of it is around cost and time to deliver infrastructure, because we know it's difficult and challenging to deliver infrastructure in the UK for lots of reasons, and water's no different in that respect. But I think government also wants to sort of get people to think more about their usage of water. I think water is definitely one of those things where it falls from the sky. Therefore, people tend to just think, well, I can turn the tap on and there's no issues. I think there's a whole culture piece around just getting people to understand the difficulties moving forward around climate change, population change, but just the pressure on clean water in a country with 65 plus million people is quite severe. Nigel, do you think government's got to do more in terms of educating the population in that respect?
I think demand reduction's really important, but there have been lots of campaigns around that over the years. And I just think that people don't perceive water as being something that there's a limit on, because it rains so much in the UK. Even in parts of the country, it rains a lot less and it doesn't rain too much. We always remember the downpour and the shower and the weeks when it doesn't stop raining. And I think that is a real problem. I think if you're in a country that's drier, for Spain or some places in Africa or Australia or somewhere, people understand it doesn't rain much, so we need to preserve water. I think culturally it's a difficult thing to sell in the UK. I think the other thing is that there are a lot more people than there used to be, and there are likely to be even more people. So I think, although on a personal level, on a sort of per capita basis, maybe the water consumption can be reduced, actually in the long run, that water consumption is going to go up. But I do think it's about trying to explain to people there's a real cost to water. There's an environmental cost. I mean, one element that we're talking about today is the reservoirs. There are clearly some environmental issues that we might come on to later around building reservoirs. Sure. But there are wider costs. So when we're building reservoirs, we're using oil, we're using diesel to build those reservoirs. And obviously we need to operate them at that higher cost. As Giles alluded to, some of the alternative mechanisms for improving water supply can be even more costly in terms of long-term environmental costs. So we need to get people to understand that. But I also think that it's not clear to people what is the use of water. So, for example, people using toilets, that can use a lot of water. At one time, there was a big campaign where my local water company gave out a small brick to pop into your cistern. And if you think that doesn't seem a lot, but multiply that across the millions of people in that system, every flush, there's a little brick's volume of water isn't gone down. So I think that's quite interesting. I think the other issue is sort of, which I understand is something that people are looking at bringing in, is differential pricing for water rates. So that, for example, if you've got a large garden, you're going to have to pay more for water rates, which maybe people start to think about then moving towards a water meter. And certainly in my last house, we had a water meter, and it makes you think a lot about using water, because in the back of your mind, you're thinking X pence per cube. So, for example, car washing we used to do that with a bucket rather than with a hose, because you're thinking, gosh, if I have a hose on a long time, that'll cost me 54 pence a unit, I think it was at the time, or something like that. So I think that sort of thing, direct pricing, is something that can be thought about. But currently, you can ask for a water meter, and if you ask for one, they'll install one. You have a right to have it removed. But the slight counter to that then comes in terms of value, that if they're perhaps just a two-person household, they'll take a water meter and they'll be paying less. And then large households will stick with the rates, or people with larger gardens. So I think pricing is the key to drive use down. But of course, that's something that is often resisted. But I think developers and refurbishment of big old buildings, etc., is something that to be considered. So using grey water, because certainly when we're building new houses now, we're looking at putting solar in there. But should we also be looking at using grey water for using for toilets and other things that you can use grey water for? And for those who aren't clear, grey water is basically taking water that falls on your roof and using that. And maybe we can capture water for other purposes from that type of use as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination, isn't it, innovation, but also government trying to change people's mindsets over a longer period of time, I think.
I think that's right. And I think James, the key thing that changes people's mind is the pound in their pockets. And I think until you start to meter everybody, you're probably not going to have a substantial impact on demand. But it's useful to sort of improve things through innovation, as you say, as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Giles, governments obviously want to sort of limit use and help to sort of mitigate the issues that we've got around water usage. But I mean, it's a hearts and minds exercise, isn't it? Because to be fair to the British, I think we're quite as virile as the French when it comes to certain things. But it's not a popular message, is it? Telling people that they can't use certain amounts of water, like Nigel said. You know, there'll be days when you can't water your garden and stuff. How do you think the water companies and government get that message across to the UK population?
I think it's a difficult one because ultimately in the UK, do we want to be controlled in terms of what we can and can't do? Yeah. And the water companies, so government, are trying to say to us, look, guys, we've got a problem here. Perhaps there has been underinvestment, but we've got a problem here in terms of supplying the water to everybody. And how do we ensure that can be maintained in terms of the uplift that's required over the next 25 years? And the government will look at water metering. How do we do that? And actually, I agree 100% that people need to have consideration as the cost. And one thing that does hit home is the cost. But they ought to be talking to the likes of the developers on grey water to say, actually, you need a tank here and you need to use it, and it needs to supply your loos, etc., and do your washing. And if you can, we used to have one at my old house, and it was great. It would last for about a week, and you would not believe how much water that you use. It'll empty it in a week. Wow. Because you just don't realise the quantities that you're using in like washing machines and that kind of thing. And it's a bit like the electricity companies, smart meters. If you're at night and you're looking at a water electricity, you can get cheap electricity at night when the cost is lower. Perhaps they do that with water in terms of actually you can have this volume, but when you go over this volume, then actually you shouldn't need that volume. But is that something that we in the UK will accept? I don't think it is. I don't think we like to be controlled. No. And there will be consequences if they start. If we haven't got the water supply there that is required, in terms of housing and development, all housing development requires the supply of water, sewage, etc. How are we going to make sure that is maintained going forward? In terms of the big development plans that the government are proposing currently, actually, have we got the supplies? And I know, I'm based down in the southeast. I know from our perspective, there's certain water companies. I mean, the classics have been all over the press. Is Tunbridge Wells. Tunbridge Wells have been saying we're not sure that we can provide the development that you're proposing in terms of the water supply, because have we got enough water? And people are beginning to ask those questions. From our perspective in the UK, we have a nasty habit of saying, right, there's a tap, we'll switch it on. If we lived in the middle of Kenya, you wouldn't get your water for a week, and you would all have to have communal baths, etc. And by the way, it will run out. From the UK, we just expect it to be there. And is that a good thing or not? Actually, it's a fantastic thing, but I do think we take it for granted big time. It's going to have an impact in terms of where we go. From the point of view of cost, the infrastructure currently is not there for what we're looking for over the next 25 years. Someone somewhere has got to build it, be it the water companies. That has a cost implication, which then will fall back on the consumer, who is you and I, who pay the bills. Right. And therefore the bills are going to go significantly higher in order to pay for this infrastructure going forward. And then there's, individual restrictions in terms of, as alluded to earlier, you must only use this amount of water, because if you do that, you're using excess amounts. I think the water companies are becoming much better better at they're preempting what is going to happen in the future. And because of that, they are actually saying to everybody, look, guys, this is going to happen. So what do we need to put in place? And we'll talk to all the relevant bodies to facilitate that, rather than, oh no, we got no water, therefore there will now be a drought order brought in. You can't use your hose pipes, etc., which, in Kent happens every 2 to 3 years on a regular basis, and it becomes part of life. As a consequence, should we be considering that in the long term, in terms of that's how we manage the water supply throughout the UK? But that opens another question in terms of how do we get water from places where they've got more water down to the south and the east of the UK, because ultimately we're the ones that have these droughts. And then there's the impact on industry and agriculture. There's a lot of farmers. There was an issue I heard of a farmer in one region whereby they did a lot of irrigation and that kind of thing through abstraction licenses. All of a sudden they said, that's it, we haven't got enough water, we're going to stop. You can't abstract. That had a major impact on the farmers and how they operated, because all of a sudden their agricultural operations not had to halt, but was severely reduced as a consequence. So there's a lot of farmers are now having to think, and it's happened with electricity as well with cold stores and that kind of thing. They're actually thinking, do we need to put a wind turbine up because the electricity is so expensive to run these? They're thinking the same on the agricultural side from the point of view of building their own reservoirs, so they've got their own supply, that they don't have to rely on the cost associated with buying it off the water companies. So there is a big impact for everybody going forward.
Just goes to show how critical water is, doesn't it, at every level of our lives, whether it's individually or, like you say, agriculture and industry. It's key. And I suppose what most people would say, in terms of both of the points that you've made, is that it's generally recognised that the infrastructure, 19% of the infrastructure leaks, which is a huge number. I mean, 19%. Most people would say, fix the leaks and we've got plenty of water. Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of, it's a simple answer. If you fix the leaks, do you need all these reservoirs?
I do think we need. I think the leaks will solve the 19%. Or part of it. You're never going to get down to zero. No. There are opportunities, there are AI that they're bringing forward associated with to try and reduce that. But, it is key in terms of how they look at the long term, and the long term solution isn't just to sort, there's a package of jobs they have to do in order to sort the problem, as opposed to the easy focal point, sort your leaks out. And I think that is a big issue going forward in terms of how we deal with the volume of water we need.
It's interesting with leaks because as a business we assist water companies in terms of undertaking works to repair pipes, and it's not straightforward. Particularly in built-up areas like London, can be quite complicated. It's not a quick fix solution, is it? You can identify the leak, but there's often a time gap then between actually fixing it once you've identified it. So I think the reality is, I suppose a lot of people would potentially think, okay, you're getting better at identifying the leaks, but does that mean you've got the resource, the capital, and the to fix them quicker? It's doubtful.
Yeah, but I think the water companies, are looking at various options to assist them from an AI perspective, which has implications, to assist them with actually monitoring proactively where the leaks are coming from, and reactively, actually there's a leak, how can we see it? There are, Affinity Water, they look at, existing broadband infrastructure to listen to fibre optic. And that's extraordinary how they do that. Yeah. But yeah, it's a way forward. Thames Water are doing the same kind of thing in terms of satellites, looking for, in effect, wet patches, movement, underground, cold areas, where they are to try and reduce that. But that doesn't, that will solve the bigger leaks, which, by the way, you can see. But will it solve the little trickles that you and I, when we're driving down the road, you'll see a wet patch and we think, someone's got a leak. I know up the road from where I live, there's been a leak and it's been running for quite a long time. And you think, why can't they just solve this out? And it's been running for about 2 weeks now. Yeah. And that's a big issue. But how do you alleviate that going forward. It's a big issue.
Yeah, it's a big challenge for them. I mean, Nigel, we work hard at Bruton Knowles to sort of use modern technology, don't we, to work better for clients. So
certainly the involvement of AI through things like Affinity and Thames listening, and then using satellite imagery to identify areas where there's likely to be a leak. Without AI, that just doesn't work. But the AI and the power of the AI computing allows that to occur. You've then got the practical element, and at the end of the day, these things do come back to somebody coming out on site, digging a hole and fixing a pipe. But of course, you can sometimes put things through and internally steal the pipes, but it does require physical work to deliver these things. And I think inevitably there will be a reduction in leaks as people focus on identifying where the big leaks are and then getting them fixed. But it's like a lot of things, to drive perhaps from 19 to 15% is probably reasonably cost effective. But to get down from the 15 to the 10, the 10 to the 5, and the cost to get down to that, I think as Giles said, it's just not feasible that there won't be any leaks. There just will in the systems of the scale that we've got. But at the end of the day, it's a cost-benefit thing as well, that the cost to get down, for, say, example, the 15 to 10% leaks might dwarf the cost of building some new reservoirs which cope with those leaks. So you've got to look at those balances. It's not, throughout my lifetime, people have talked about leaks and we should fix them. And certainly the water companies we work for and the people I talk to, everybody wants to fix leaks, and people have done their best for years and years to fix them. But it's not that simple. And I think that's one of the reasons why you've got to build some new reservoirs to put new capacity out there, because without that capacity, you've got problems. So you can try to fix the system that we've got. And I think the other thing is we always got to recognise that it is quite an ageing system, that the UK was one of the first countries in the world to have a proper system. And if you stand back about it and think, it's actually amazing that nearly all properties in the UK, you can come in, you can turn the tap on and you've got something you can drink. Now, that doesn't happen in large parts of the world, and throughout history that has never happened. So to think that we get that for the sort of price that we get, and we touched on pricing earlier, but if we actually say what percentage of our cost is water cost, it's actually quite a small percentage of people's annual budget. So if that was to go up by 10%, 20% to guarantee it, in reality, in real numbers, it's not huge. It's probably less than the cost of a cup of coffee, which is the one that we usually balance things around today. It's less than going to Costa or Starbucks, or there are other coffee shops you can go to. But to get that facility, I think, and sometimes we just don't really recognise that, to be able to just go and turn your tap on and get drinkable quality water overnight is amazing. So yeah, the water companies are stopping leaks. They're doing their best. They're using the modern technology to identify them and fix them. But at the end of the day, there always will be leaks, as there will be in any system. And it's the same in electricity. I mean, the amount of electricity that gets put in a power station is not the amount of electricity that comes out at the other end. So, they just are in systems. I think that's just part of the nature of them, isn't it?
And then there's an issue over, costs in terms of all of this. Quite often is the bigger picture in terms of those costs and how you control them. And I know that, the water companies are looking at cost reduction the whole time through AI in terms of efficiencies in use from the point of view of pumping stations and pipe house, how you move kit around the UK. Don't do it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when it's peak flows. Do it at a cheaper time in terms of pumping water to a water tower or a reservoir or attenuation tank or whatever. It's how they use that and how they think about that delivery across the region. And I think they're looking at those efficiencies, and AI will certainly assist them on doing that. An amazing thing that I heard, was it Southern Water were talking about, they monitor their sewers to make sure that they can monitor where there's fat build up. So from their point of view, that increases the efficiency and that will impact on the environment and that kind of thing. That is really clever in terms of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And a lot of it comes down to them creating efficiencies and trying to reduce costs, which ultimately impacts on you and I as the consumer.
It certainly helps them know their systems better, doesn't it, in terms of identifying all the issues around it. So, I think technology has definitely got a place to play. I think all of it, not surprisingly, sits in the modern context of environmental issues, and certainly the bad PR that the water companies have had over foul water going into our streams and rivers and then ultimately into the sea has been a bit of a disaster for all of the water companies. But I suppose it does demonstrate the issues and sensitivities around how people see the environment these days. So all of what we've discussed has to sit within that modern context that you need to safeguard and look after the environment as well.
You do, and it's really important. And one of the impacts of, for instance, the AI. Oh, let's go through AI, etc. But AI has a massive energy requirement and a massive water cooling requirement.
Yeah.
So therefore that has an impact. So, that impacts on something else that's completely separate to what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So those efficiencies are being driven, but they're, by the fact they're there, are creating inefficiencies. And that causes massive problems going forward. But yeah, there are big drivers that we need to assist the water companies to focus, but they are much better at looking at the bigger picture rather than just isolated leaks.
Yeah, there's a big debate around data centres and their locations because they're so massively hungry for water and electricity. So, you're going to end up with hubs and specialist areas where they congregate. But it's just that it demonstrates how the modern world keeps evolving, doesn't it? In terms of there's always something around the corner that puts pressure on water companies to supply water in high volumes in new areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always going to be that pressure as we progress on. And it's also perhaps looking at different types of water, and maybe water that can be used for cooling doesn't need the same extent of purification as water that you need for drinking. So I think there are some things that be considered there. And as Giles mentioned earlier, you can develop your own sort of reservoirs for particular sites and particular uses, and fill those up when there's less pressure on, less demand. But I think the other problem is that water's a sort of physical entity as well. So,
very much so.
that you can build a reservoir, but it has a certain capacity. So it's not quite as easy to say, well, we'll fill that when it rains and then we'll use it when it's dry, because if it's dry for longer than the water that you've got, then you've got a problem. And I think that people building things like data centres, they want to be able to be sure that they can work their data centre 24/7, 365 days a year, and not be in the position that the farmers are that we mentioned earlier, who can be in trouble because they can't get access to water. So it's they want consistency of supply, really.
So how do you create that consistency? And one thing that's happened over the last X amount of years is that the water companies are talking to the other water bodies, being the EA, the canals, those kind of providers. And how do we get water from the north, Wales, etc., to the southeast using them? And there are discussions. I heard up obviously in Wales they get quite a lot of rain. How do you get it from Wales to the southeast? And what you can do is chuck it in the Thames, or chuck it in a river, then pump it out the river to the Thames, pump it out from the Thames down to the southeast, pump it out down in the southeast, and then bang, you've moved all this water numerous miles in a river, and you can do the same with the canal network in terms of how you move water around big volumes from north to south or east to west, and they are seriously thinking about that, which is really, really good in terms of the bigger picture. And the government and the bodies are actually talking to one another because they all have assets that can be utilised, because a pipe, the usual is we'll move everything by pipe, but actually that has big implications from the point of view of the environment, local communities in terms of when the works are going on, impact on the environment around us in terms of the birds, the location, the impact on the community. How do we deal with those? And those existing infrastructures are there, so let's use them. But one thing, there was an interesting thing. Somebody was talking about a hard water and soft water and how you combine the two. It's an engineering issue.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's but it is interesting because I think it's there's certainly a recognition in the UK that it's imperfect in the sense that, like you say, we've got areas of the country that have got more water than others, but it doesn't necessarily affect where people want to live and work. So effectively, physically moving large volumes of water it just sounds difficult, but it's also extremely expensive and very time consuming as well. So I think if you can use existing river networks without having a detrimental environmental impact, it's a great idea. But I think the key thing you said is it's people talking to each other, isn't it? It's that kind of one of the issues around deregulation, certainly since privatisation, is there's an overall sense that there's less joined up thinking around infrastructure in the UK. So I think perhaps government needs to encourage that a bit more, where it's a bit more collegiate for people to come up with innovative solutions.
I think that is one of the interesting things, is when you look at the proposed reservoirs, they're being proposed by a number of different companies. And each company is its own legal entity, it's got its own licence, and it operates in its own way. But the problem is that maybe that's not the best thing. Maybe if you had several large reservoirs that different companies could tap into is potentially one way to rethink this. But of course, each company's got its own position, and maybe in terms of actual impact, several smaller reservoirs is better than a large one. But it is something to bear in mind that each company is a separate legal entity, and they're obviously licensed. So Ofwat have quite a key role in that, and allowing them to get the funding from the bills to develop these things. But at the end of the day, there's potentially less joined up thinking because we have separate legal entities, rather than if they were all in the same ownership or all sat under government.
I think that would lead to an approach where there's people reinventing wheels, in the sense that, because I think one of the things you and I have discussed in the past is that, if you take the sort of things like police stations, most police authorities design their own police. There isn't a single entity that says, right, if you want a police station that fits so many people in it, here's the design, and you build that everywhere in the UK because it's a cheaper way of doing it. Basically, it's almost like a system-built system. A lot of what we do in the UK is bespoke.
I think there is an element to that. I think the problem with reservoirs is they tend to need to be a bit bespoke because they're part of the environment and need to be in a sort of water catchment area. But I suspect the thing that mitigates a little bit against that is that they usually use one of a relatively small number of design consultants. So I think the design consultants will be bringing in what their knowledge is across the board. And in some ways, it's the same as sort of Bruton Knowles, where we act for a number of different water companies in different parts of the country. And we, because of our internal systems, can cross-pollinate that knowledge that we learn, for example, in Thames into Yorkshire, for example, things like that. So although what we're doing in each area is bespoke and slightly different, because that's how it works with separate clients, some of that knowledge is transferred across. So hopefully that'll be the case. But it's just that people need to have their own independence. So if you're the Tunbridge Wells supplier, you need to be comfortable that you're going to be able to supply there. And I think that potentially that's a role for government and Ofwat to sit back and say, well, actually, more on a strategic basis, we need several very large reservoirs, or we need a solution for the southeast, and you can all take from that. So I think that's one of the interesting things, that actually it's being promoted by the water companies themselves and not by more of a supra body that sits over above them.
And there's obviously an element of best practice that cuts across it all, like you say, that ultimately you end up with reservoirs that are fit for purpose, relevant to where they are and what they're being used for. Yeah. So,
I mean, there's big impacts in terms of, one of the big problems we've got, it goes back to the ice age really, is we've got a problem with volumes of water in the southeast. The southeast is relatively flat. So as a consequence, how do you build reservoirs where it's relatively flat? Up north, so Wales, Scotland, etc. They've got areas that you could utilise for that. Okay, we have got reservoirs, pure water reservoir, in the southeast, but it does make life quite difficult. In East Anglia, it's relatively flat. In Oxfordshire, it's relatively flat. They need reservoirs there. But how are they going to do it? They, in effect, can't use the local hills, etc., to facilitate what's required. They've got to look at other options, which have cost implications. Yeah. If that isn't there, I know out in New Zealand, they've got these look like massive lakes. They're not. They're massive reservoirs, aqueducts, power. They use them for water and for power. And they're up in the mountains, and it's absolutely amazing. We, by using rivers and main pipelines that we all have access to, ought to and are thinking about how we get water from areas that have water to other areas, but it's got to be cost effective. You look at Thames Water many moons ago put the London Ring main in. So it goes around the M25 somewhere, that basically that instead of having the North Circular or South Circular in London, from their point of view, they've got it running M25. So that means that they can deliver their water to other water companies via that main. So strategically, they're very well placed because they, looked at how they were going to do it. Actually, they didn't look at it in isolation. The problem we've got is that because the companies, it's how they all cross-pollinate and talk to one another to actually ensure that they're doing the best for the UK as opposed to that individual company, because that's what trips them up ultimately. They've got to look at the bigger picture, and usually they're really good at doing it, but there's certain elements of that delivery or, that is not looking at the big picture, which is, something that the government, other bodies are taking an interest in terms of how we do it. And one of the big drivers behind it is consumers. Consumers are saying, enough, we've got enough pollution, we want to stop it, we've got enough leaks, we want to reduce costs, what are you doing about it? And they're asking the right questions to the water companies, who are having to navel gaze in terms of from making the right decisions that fit all the questions that are being asked by those bodies and the individuals, and ultimately the customer, who is you and I.
Yeah, and I think that sums it up quite well in terms of where we find ourselves in terms of the current marketplace for water. Is that there's a lot more knowledge from members of the public. There's there's groups now that are challenging water companies around water usage, etc. To conclude, where do we think this all sits within the context of water over the next 10 years? What do we actually think the water companies can achieve in the next 10 years, given the environmental issues? Certainly, I agree with you, Giles, a lot more sensitivity from the public in terms of things like leakage, things like the environment. What do we think the water companies can do in the next 10 years?
They need to spend some money, lots of money.
Lots of money.
And they need to actually, there's one thing that's actually key is at the moment, there's an awful lot of development that's required in terms of development of their assets to get these water supplies in place that are not actually going to happen fast enough. So therefore, the government is assisting from the point of view of, nationally significant infrastructure and pulling the reservoir scenario into that, which allows the water companies to actually facilitate construction of these reservoirs that, I think the last reservoir that was built was back in the 1960s. I know where I lived, that South East Water, Broad Oak Road Reservoir has been talked about for 35 years. It's really important that these reservoirs happen rather than, we now, which is a good thing, the water companies, and the government are very, they're reactive. They need to be proactive, which it seems to be they may taking a step in the right direction in terms of actually this is required. What do we need to do to facilitate this? And in order to do this, actually put them within the NSIP regime, and that enables the process to be big decisions to be made by government as opposed to local communities. The local communities absolutely should have a say in what goes on and how it happens, but we do need to look at the bigger picture. You look in France, if they want a road located in a certain position, they go and talk to the farmers, but actually we've talked to you, we've taken on board, this is what's going to happen. It happens quite quickly. We've got a number of infrastructure projects that have been going on for 5-10 years, cost an absolute fortune, and we've not actually taken a step forward. And that cannot be the way forward in terms of in 20 years' time, it's having an impact on, development, be it commercial, residential, our bills, etc., is having an impact on that going forward. And actually, let's see a result that resolves the problem, as opposed to in 10 years' time, we're going to look back and say, we actually have not stepped forward at all. All we've got is we've now got a problem because we can't make a decision based on lots of information. We've actually got to make a decision now because it's a need, as opposed to actually we looked at this and these are the options. We have only one option. Yeah. We've got to do it now because we've run out of time. Yeah. A bit like certain other elements of the infrastructure. It's really important that we look at that and look at it and get something done about it. It's how we facilitate that. Environmentally, there's big issues as well that need to be taken into account. You can't just run roughshod. We need to make sure that we look after, protected species, ancient trees, etc., the environment that we live in, because that's why we enjoy living in the UK, because of the environment we live in. Let's make the most of it. Let's actually, talk to the farmers, the local communities in terms of what we do, and actually have those conversations as to what is the best solution. But we got to look at the bigger picture, not the small picture.
Okay, thank you, Giles. Nigel?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But if you're looking at a 5-year horizon, you need to get these things permitted. I think, as Giles said, you need to get through the system and actually get the permits out. They need to then be funded, which I think is something with Ofwat and the bills, etc., that we touched on, and started. And I think in terms of the environmental issues, although there's obviously always lots of objections in the locality of big projects, what we also have to remember is that quite often reservoirs, once they're in place, they become attractions in their own right.
Indeed.
That people like in the UK bodies of water. You can do various things, and perhaps in parts of the design, if you design in potential leisure uses around those reservoirs, that's got to be a good thing. And certainly, if you look up in parts of the Lake District and North Wales, etc., and certainly in the Peak District, the reservoirs in their own rights, they are attractions. And I think that we need to be looking at that more, so that at the end of the day, there are some benefits, not just from the use of water, but there are environmental benefits and leisure benefits in those areas as well. So, but I think, as Giles said, the key thing is to actually make some progress in the next 5 years. Not to have things sat delayed and waiting. And certainly from BK's point of view, we've been approached time and time again over the last 20 years to start the process of land reference, etc., for potential reservoirs here and potential reservoirs there, and then they just disappear and nothing happens and they're not progressed. And I think it's that time has run out really, and they do need to progress those. So if you can get that done in the next 5 years, and then hopefully within the next 5 to 10, you can actually finalise and commission these reservoirs. And as Giles said, they're not easy to build because you're starting mainly on flat areas, so you've got to build up the banks all around the sides, and there's a lot of work to be done. But if you did start now, you got permitted and you got funded in the next 5 years, that gives you a fighting chance to get these things up and running before 2050.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Nigel and Giles for sharing their thoughts and insights. If you've enjoyed today's episode, you can find more from the series on all major podcast platforms. So please do subscribe, follow and share with your network. And if you'd like to stay up to date, the latest thinking across the property and infrastructure sectors, be sure to check out Bruton Knowles Landmark newsletter on LinkedIn, where we regularly share insights, analysis and commentary from across our sectors. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.